The greatest obstacle to building a reliable mind isn't lack of effort. It's that most people are building the wrong thing entirely. Watch someone preparing for an examination. They sit with their textbook open, reading the same paragraphs over and over. They copy definitions onto index cards. They highlight sentences until the page looks like a rainbow. Hours disappear into this work. But what's actually being constructed inside their mind? They're creating the illusion of knowledge. The words become familiar. The equations start to look comfortable. There's a warm feeling of recognition when they see the material again. And this feeling is treacherous because it masquerades as understanding. The brain confuses familiarity with comprehension, and the student walks into the examination room believing they know something, only to discover they know nothing at all. Most people treat their minds like storage containers. They pour information in, hoping it will stay there, available when needed. They memorize formulas, collect facts, and believe that repetition will somehow transform these fragments into understanding. But a mind built this way is brittle. It can recite information, it can pass certain tests, but when confronted with a genuinely new problem, something it hasn't seen before in exactly that form, it shatters. The mind that can't fail isn't built through accumulation. It's built through a completely different process, one that looks nothing like what most people call studying. The real test of knowledge isn't whether you can recognize the right answer when you see it. The real test is whether you can generate the answer from nothing, using only the principles you understand. And that requires a fundamentally different kind of structure in your mind. Think about the difference between a photograph and a map. A photograph captures what something looks like from one angle, frozen in time. It's detailed, it's accurate for that specific view, but it's also completely rigid. Change your position slightly, and the photograph becomes useless. A map, on the other hand, is an abstraction. It shows relationships, connections, the underlying structure of a territory. With a good map, you can navigate from any starting point to any destination, even through routes you've never traveled before. Most people build their minds like photograph albums. They collect images of solutions, examples they've seen, problems their teacher worked through on the blackboard. But when they encounter a new problem, a different angle, they're lost. They flip through their mental photographs, looking for an exact match, and when they don't find one, they have nowhere to go. The mind that can't fail is built like a map. It contains principles, not pictures. It understands the relationships between ideas, the deep structure that underlies the surface details. And this kind of mind isn't built through passive absorption. It's built through active reconstruction. Here's the first principle. Never trust that you understand something until you can build it from scratch. Not recite it, not recognize it, but actually construct it, starting from the most basic elements you're certain about. Suppose you're trying to understand why objects fall at the same rate regardless of their weight. You could memorize this fact. You could even memorize the historical story that goes with it. But none of that is understanding. Understanding means you can start from what you know about forces and motion and derive this result yourself. You can explain why a hammer and a feather, in the absence of air resistance, must fall together. You can work through the logic step by step, and if someone challenges any step, you can defend it or discover your error. This is exhausting work. It's much harder than reading and highlighting. It takes 10 times longer, but it builds a completely different structure in your mind. Instead of memorizing a conclusion, you've built the pathway to that conclusion. And that pathway can be used again, in different contexts, to reach different conclusions you've never seen before. Most students read a chapter in their textbook, perhaps once, perhaps twice. They feel they understand it because the logic seems to flow smoothly as they read. The author has done the work of making it clear, but this is deceptive. The clarity belongs to the author, not to the reader. Close the book and try to recreate that explanation from memory, and you'll discover how little actually transferred to your mind. The difference is between watching someone else think and thinking yourself. When you watch someone solve a problem on a blackboard, their solution looks elegant, even obvious. Of course, you think, that's clearly the right approach. But put yourself in front of a blank page with a similar problem, and suddenly nothing is obvious. The steps that seemed natural when someone else took them now feel impossible to discover on your own. This is why the second principle is essential. You don't understand something unless you can explain it simply, without jargon, to someone who knows nothing about it. This isn't about making things elementary. It's about testing whether you've grasped the essential idea or just memorized the sophisticated sounding words that surround it. When you try to explain something, really explain it, you discover the gaps in your understanding immediately. You reach for a word you've been using comfortably, and suddenly you realize you don't actually know what it means. You start a sentence explaining how one thing leads to another, and halfway through you discover you can't finish it because you don't see how the pieces connect. These moments of confusion are precious. They're showing you exactly where your understanding is false. Most people avoid this discomfort. When they hit a point they can't explain, they skip over it, tell themselves it's not important, or hide behind technical language that sounds impressive but means nothing to them. But this is precisely the point where the mind that can't fail does something different. It stops and refuses to move forward until the confusion is resolved. It treats every gap in understanding as a structural weakness that must be repaired before building higher. Imagine trying to explain to a bright 10-year-old why ice floats in water. You can't use technical terms they don't know. You can't wave your hands and say it's because of density without explaining what density means and why it matters. You have to think through the actual mechanism, the real reason, in terms of concepts you're both certain about. And in doing this, you often discover that your own understanding was more fragile than you realized. The third principle seems backwards at first. You learn something by trying to solve problems you can't solve yet. Not after you've learned the material, but as the method of learning it. This seems impossible. How can you solve a problem before you know how? But here's the crucial insight. Struggling with a problem you can't solve yet puts your mind in a completely different state than passively reading about the solution. When you struggle, genuinely struggle, your mind is actively searching for patterns, testing possibilities, discovering what doesn't work. And this struggle creates a structure, a framework of questions and attempted approaches. Then, when you finally see the solution, or derive it yourself, or read the relevant chapter, that information doesn't land on passive ground. It lands on prepared ground. Your mind has already carved out the exact shape that this knowledge fits into. The understanding is deeper, more permanent, because you've experienced the problem it solves. Compare two students learning the same concept. The first reads the chapter, understands the explanation, then does practice problems to reinforce it. The second looks at practice problems first, struggles with them, fails, gets confused, then reads the chapter. The second student will understand more deeply and remember longer, even though they spent time failing. The failure wasn't wasted time. It was preparation. This is why the sequence matters so much. Most people try to fill their minds first, then apply what they've learned. But the mind that can't fail is built through the opposite sequence. Attempt, fail, understand, then succeed. The failure creates the structure that makes understanding possible. But there's something even deeper happening here. Something about the nature of real knowledge versus the appearance of knowledge. Real knowledge is a living thing. It connects to other knowledge. It generates new questions. It can be applied in situations you've never seen before. The appearance of knowledge is dead. It's a collection of statements you can repeat, but they're isolated, disconnected from the rest of what you know. The way to tell the difference is simple. Can you use this knowledge to think new thoughts? Can you take two ideas you understand and combine them to reach a conclusion you've never been taught? If your knowledge is real, you can. If it's merely the appearance of knowledge, you can't. This is why memorization alone, no matter how thorough, builds a mind that fails. Memorized knowledge doesn't connect to anything. It's like having 1,000 puzzle pieces scattered on a table instead of assembled into a picture. You might be able to describe each piece accurately, but you can't see what they make together. The mind that can't fail is built by constantly making connections. When you learn something new, you don't just add it to your collection. You ask, how does this relate to what you already know? Does it contradict something you thought was true? Does it explain something that previously seemed mysterious? Does it open up new questions? This active process of connection making is what transforms information into understanding. And it's something you have to do deliberately because it doesn't happen automatically. Your mind won't make these connections just because the information is sitting there. You have to force the connections by asking questions, by trying to use new knowledge in different contexts, by testing whether it really fits with everything else you know. Here's something most people never realize. Understanding isn't something you achieve and then possess. It's something you maintain through constant use. Leave a piece of knowledge unused for long enough, and it degrades. Not because you forget it, exactly, but because the connections weaken. The knowledge becomes isolated again, and isolated knowledge is useless. This is why the fourth principle matters. Keep returning to fundamentals, not to memorize them, but to see them more deeply each time. Every time you revisit a basic principle with more experience, you see it differently. You notice implications you missed before. You understand why it's formulated the way it is. You see connections to advanced topics that weren't visible when you first learned it. The student who races through material once, checking off topics as learned, builds a shallow mind. The student who returns repeatedly to core ideas, seeing them anew each time with more context, builds depth. And depth is what makes a mind reliable. When you understand something deeply, you don't forget it because it's woven into the structure of your thinking. Consider how this works with something as basic as fractions. A child first learns that a half means one of two equal pieces. Simple enough. But come back to fractions after learning multiplication, and you see that a half is also the same as dividing by 2. Come back after learning decimals, and you see it's the same as 0.5. Come back after learning ratios, percentages, probabilities, and each time the concept of a fraction reveals new depths. It's not a new thing you're learning. It's the same idea showing different faces depending on what you can now see. This is how knowledge becomes truly yours, not by collecting it once, but by returning to it, reconsidering it, seeing it from new angles as your understanding grows. And this creates something remarkable, a mind where everything connects to everything else, where each piece of knowledge strengthens all the others. But building this kind of mind requires accepting something uncomfortable. You will be confused most of the time. Real learning, the kind that builds understanding rather than the appearance of understanding, lives in confusion. You're confused because you're genuinely thinking about something you don't yet grasp. You're trying to fit it into what you know, discovering it doesn't fit, questioning whether what you knew before was wrong, testing possibilities. Most people flee from this confusion. They want everything to be clear immediately. When they feel confused, they assume they're doing something wrong, that they need a better explanation, a simpler textbook, a more patient teacher. But confusion isn't a sign of failure. It's a sign that real thinking is happening. The mind that can't fail has learned to be comfortable with confusion, to even seek it out. Because on the other side of confusion, fought through honestly, is understanding that actually means something. The student who avoids confusion builds a mind full of statements they can recite but don't understand. The student who works through confusion builds a mind that can think. Here's how this looks in practice. You're reading about a concept that seems to contradict something you learned before. Instead of skipping past this discomfort, you stop. You write down both ideas clearly. You think about whether they really contradict each other or whether you're misunderstanding one of them. You try to find the exact point where they seem to conflict. You work through examples to see which idea holds up. You might spend an hour on this, maybe more. And at the end, either you've discovered that there's no real contradiction, just a misunderstanding on your part, or you've found a genuine error in something you thought you knew. This is slow. It's frustrating. But this is how you build a mind that won't collapse when tested. Because you've tested it yourself, constantly, as you built it. The final element that makes a mind reliable is the willingness to check everything yourself. Not because you distrust teachers or textbooks, but because checking things yourself is how you make knowledge your own. When you're told that 2 + 2 = 4, you can accept it. But have you ever actually thought about why? Not just counted objects, but understood what addition means at a fundamental level, why it has the properties it does. Most people accept enormous amounts of knowledge on authority. Their teachers said it, the textbook confirmed it, it appeared on the examination, so it must be true. And maybe it is true, but it's not their knowledge, it's borrowed knowledge. And borrowed knowledge fails when you need it most. The mind that can't fail contains only knowledge that's been personally verified. This doesn't mean you derive everything from first principles, though sometimes you should. It means you've thought about whether each piece of knowledge makes sense, whether it fits with everything else you know, whether you can see why it should be true. You've made it yours through understanding, not just acceptance. This is the difference between education and training. Training gives you procedures to follow. Do this, then this, then this, and you'll get the right answer. Education gives you understanding that lets you figure out what to do in situations you've never seen before. Training creates minds that work like machines, reliable only when operating within their designed parameters. Education creates minds that can adapt, improvise, think. And here's the beautiful thing about building this kind of mind. Once it's built, it becomes easier to add to it. Each new piece of real understanding makes the next piece easier to grasp because you have more foundation to build on, more connections to make. The student who builds their mind properly finds that learning accelerates over time. The student who builds on memorization finds that each new topic is as hard as the last because nothing truly connects. The mind that can't fail isn't built quickly. It's built through patient, honest work, through refusing to pretend you understand when you don't, through struggling with confusion until it resolves into clarity, through making connections until everything you know forms a unified whole. And when you've built this kind of mind, something remarkable happens. Problems that would terrify other people become puzzles you can actually solve. Not because you've memorized more, but because you can think. You can take what you understand and use it to figure out what you don't. You can see patterns, make connections, build solutions from fundamental principles. This is what it means to have a mind that can't fail. Not that you'll never make mistakes, but that your understanding is deep enough and connected enough that you can find and correct your own errors. You can trust yourself to think because you've built something solid, something real, something that won't crumble when the pressure comes.